Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an enormous honor, and I appreciate the Speaker's ruling earlier today that allows me to bring to the floor of this place an urgent matter, an emergency that's on the minds and the hearts of every single Canadian. I want to signal as I begin that I will be splitting my time with the honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, my colleague and friend who I can remember, actually, we were still sitting in the House together when he was the first member of Parliament to suggest that people ought to be wearing masks, drawing on experience of what was working in other countries. Well, Madam Speaker, back then when we were all together, up until the Friday, March 13th of last year, I wouldn't have imagined that I'd be standing here, speaking to you virtually tonight in the third wave of COVID, where we speak of things like variants of concern. We're no longer dealing with COVID-19 alone. We're dealing, as we know now, with variants of concern emerging from other countries. We've had them from South Africa, B117 from the UK, P1 from Brazil, and there will be more. We now are learning as we go that the longer the pandemic stalks us as a human population, we will be susceptible to, as the virus does what viruses do and mutates, we will face new forms of this particular virus as variants. We now know some of these variants are far more transmissible than the COVID-19. Can you imagine? We can be nostalgic about an earlier form of COVID-19. I wouldn't have imagined it. But the wash your hands, don't touch your face rules don't seem to apply with variants that appear that can be transmitted far more easily, including and as aerosols. I realize, Madam Speaker, that I failed to turn on my interpretation device. That's not helping our interpreters. I'm sorry. The situation we are now in is one that I think requires of us that we do something different. We have been, the situation we're now in is described frequently as a race between the vaccines and the variants. But even this particular description, I don't think will serve us well. That's because we are a fragmented federation with far too many tendencies towards blaming somebody for the situation in which we find ourselves. I gravely fear that partisanship and federal-provincial tensions will make matters worse. We need to figure out how to offer our constituents what they want, solutions, and not casting blame upon one another. None of us in this place are experts on pandemics. Well, maybe there's potentially one. There's a scientist among us who is a medical geographer who studied the Spanish flu outbreak in the member for Etobicoke North. But let's just say this is a place full of people who've been elected to serve the public of this country, and we have to be of service. And at this time, I think that means blowing the whistle on saying what we're doing now isn't working. In Mark Carney's new book, which I highly recommend, called Values, he discusses many things, but one of them is COVID-19 and the different responses from governments around the world. And I think the terminology he uses is very apt and understandable. Some governments, he said, used the hammer. Others chose the dance. Guess which ones we are? Reminded me of Mike Ryan, the World Health Organization officer, who more than a year ago said with a thick Scottish accent, it was time that we recognize we have to be fast. Don't wait to be correct. It's important, have no regrets, move. Well, we're still in the dance. And I don't blame any politician or party for this. A lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is relying on a fragmented federation and no one wanting to step on anybody else's toes. It's not working, speaking of dancing. This is a very important point that comes from Dr. Yanir Bar-Yam. He's an expert in complex systems. He's at the New England Complex Systems Institute. And he said this, quote, vaccinations shouldn't be expected to be a get out of jail free card to end the pandemic. Now, if we're in a debate where one group of people wants to blame the federal government for not buying enough vaccines because the vaccines are our way out, it's important to keep vaccines in perspective. They aren't our get out of jail free card. More must be done. And the more that must be done often falls under provincial jurisdiction. Why are we not learning the lessons from what worked and didn't work in the first and second wave? Can't we successfully share that some provinces and territories have been spectacular in going to zero COVID? Can't the rest of us learn from that? Can't we ask our institutions and our public health experts to say, you know what, bending the curve isn't the thing. We thought it was the thing. We don't blame you for thinking it was the thing, but now we have to go to zero COVID. Because if we're bending the curve and flattening the curve, we're allowing COVID to last among us longer. We will have more variants because we will have more mutations, because that's what viruses do. Now, there are many examples around the world. Some were able to go to zero COVID fast because their publics were used to being bossed around. That's a theory that you read in many of the articles and journals that they're fashionable now. Well, what do you do with a society like Canada that's got a population that's used to having our liberties? We're not good at being told where we can and can't go. But I contrast that with Australia. I mean, I think Australia is our best example. They are also a federation. They also have a federal government, and they have 8 states that have their own rules and jurisdictions. What they did at the beginning was figure out that they needed a new structure. I think Canada needs new structures. Australia decided to put together 2 different committees. One was chaired by their equivalent of Dr. Theresa Tam, with all the people around the table, whether their equivalent of Rob Strang from Nova Scotia or Bonnie Henry from British Columbia. They sat at the same table and tried to figure out what they're going to do based on the best science. Our approach has been a bit more chaotic, a bit more differentiated, and we haven't got a single structure that says, how do we learn? Who's doing it right? Who's getting the best results? Can we not ask our public health experts now to please work together and inform politicians at all orders of government what going to zero looks like for Canada? I think second guessing Canadians' attitudes and saying we can't tell people to stay home because they're sick of it. If our publics believe, if our citizenry accepts that we actually have a formula that works based on experiences elsewhere, and that if we do it hard, we get it right, we go to zero, then we can be like New Zealand and Australia and be greeting our families with open arms in the airports that just opened. Right now, I think we need to stop more of the flights that are coming in from other countries. We don't want people flying in from India, bringing new variants, bringing new disease. We don't even want interprovincial transport. Newfoundland and Labrador was really doing well in the Atlantic bubble till workers flying in from their jobs in Alberta brought COVID into the communities. We have to be serious about locking down and going to zero. Lastly, Madam Speaker, I just want to read from, and I want to credit journalist Andrew Nikiforuk, whose 2008 book on pandemics called Pandemonium gave him a lot of knowledge as a journalist, which he has been sharing. I think if we'd followed the advice that he gave in a January article in the Tyee, COVID could be over in Canada by now. But I just want to read this from his most recent article. Quote, "Get on with it. Canada needs to put this pandemic behind us. To do that, we need more aggressive and proactive public health approach with intensive testing, a better targeted, quicker and stricter lockdowns. We need to do what it takes to get to zero to protect the greater public health. And the sooner we do that, the healthier our nation will be." I talk to parents throughout my riding and all over Canada who don't want to send their kids to school because they're not masked. They wonder why it is that teachers aren't being vaccinated up front. They want to know why different provinces have different rules. They want to know, how come Nova Scotia was so smart? They want to know, why did our governments make mistakes? But it's not with a spirit of blame. We must not blame particularly individual politicians. Everyone is doing their best. Let's just take that as written. Everyone is doing their best. But collectively as a country, we are not doing what Canadians want and what Canadians deserve. And so I ask us now tonight in this debate, please, to all my colleagues, set aside blame and finger pointing. Think about, what do our constituents want of us? And is it not time to say, let's learn from what Canadian provinces and territories succeeded and apply that to where we're not doing so well, and with no blame and no shame, form a new committee, as my Green Party leader, Annamie Paul, has been calling for consistently, an interprovincial task force that decides as a country what we do to get through this together. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Isles.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Saanich Gulf Islands for asking for this emergency debate this evening. I think that it's very important to have this discussion. Certainly, I think that there's a lot to be learned, and I really appreciate her approach to this. I just want to go back to the examples that she continually was using throughout her speech. She talked about comparing Canada quite a bit to New Zealand and Australia. I mean, New Zealand and Australia are quite unique. They're both island nations. The only way to really get in and out is by plane. Canada has the longest land border in the world and has a lot of first responders and frontline workers crossing that border every single day. Literally, people live on one side and work on the other side and are going back and forth every single day. Is it not a little bit unfair to use Australia and New Zealand as comparators in this case?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
We could use New Brunswick. We could talk about Nova Scotia. These are not separate countries surrounded by water. They are our neighbors and our friends, and they did better. I think we need to learn. And in the case, and the Honourable Member is absolutely right, people going back and forth across borders, people like the Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest raised in his SO31 today, that the people in Southwest New Brunswick and related to people in Campobello, and they have to go back and forth. We have a lot of geographical situations that require specific solutions. Better testing, better tracing. Testing and tracing are very inconsistently applied across the country. Being sure that we know what essential work is going on. Is it really essential that Site C continued to be built at a time when there were outbreaks there that were a threat to Indigenous communities? Was it really essential? That's
to give some opportunity for more questions, the Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her initiative in causing this debate tonight. I think it's very valuable, and I thank her for her leadership on this. She mentioned the word emergency many times, and I have in front of me the Emergencies Act of Canada. It's the only flagship legislation we have from 1988, and I want to quote from it. It says, "A national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity of a province to deal with it." It also says a public welfare emergency is caused by a real or imminent disease in human beings that results or may result in a danger to life or property, social disruption, or a breakdown in the flow of essentials. Would my honourable colleague not agree that if this legislation is not enacted now, in a global pandemic once in a century, that there's no time that it would be invoked? And I specifically would refer to Ontario. Would she agree with me that clearly the ability of Ontario to handle this pandemic?
To give the Honourable Member an opportunity to answer, please, the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway. I think it was back in March when I pulled it out because people kept saying we don't want to use draconian legislation. And I read the Emergencies Act and realized, oh, this isn't the War Measures Act. There's no suspension of civil liberties here. There's parliamentary and democratic oversight. In fact, that piece of legislation, which was written in 1988, shows what happens when parliamentarians turn their mind to what would a sensible country do in a public health emergency, and they drafted it when they weren't in an emergency. I think it's a very worthwhile looking at.
Honorable député de Shefford.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for her speech, but above all, for bringing forward this important debate on the third wave, because we are all exhausted by the pandemic. I would like to go back. She talked a lot about the example of other countries who better controlled their borders. Before the first waves, for example, my spouse came back from Egypt to the Montreal airport around March 6th. There was already pressure from the government of Quebec to control what was going on in the Montreal airport. My spouse arrived from Egypt where there was cases, and he managed to leave the airport in Montreal with no controls whatsoever. I would like her thoughts on
merci à ma collègue de Shepherd. C'est tout à fait d'accord avec l'importance dans une situation d'urgence de protéger les frontières. Ça, c'est une des leçons. Donc, maintenant, nous sommes, comme elle a dit, dans la troisième vague. On doit apprendre les leçons d'expérience de toute la dernière année. Merci.